They say you can't kill a memory, but for $11 billion a day, you can certainly try. Once, this company was the blue-collar hero of America. It was built on a simple sugary promise, a fresh donut and a hot cup of coffee for the working man. It was a place that had a soul. But to survive the modern world, that soul had to be sold. In a brutal act of corporate survival, the company declared war on its own history. They fired the bakers, they froze the dough, and finally, they executed their own name. Today, the donut is dead. The open kettle is closed. What remains is a high-speed digital machine designed to fuel an addiction, not feed a community. This is not just a business case study. This is the story of a civil war. This is how Dunkin betrayed its past to buy its future. The idealistic rise. Our story begins in the gray industrial haze of post-war America. The year is 1948. The place is Quincy, Massachusetts, a working-class town of shipbuilders, granite cutters, and factory workers. It was a world of steel-toed boots, early mornings, and hard, physical labor. And in this world, William Rosenberg was a king. But he was not a king of industry or finance. He was the king of the lunch wagon. Rosenberg was a man forged by the fires of the Great Depression. He had dropped out of school in the 8th grade to support his family during the hardest economic winter in American history. He had shoveled snow for pennies, delivered telegrams in the rain, and hauled heavy blocks of ice on his back. He was not a man of letters. He was a man of hustle. He possessed an intuitive, almost supernatural understanding of the American working man because he was one. He knew what it felt like to be tired, to be cold, and to have only a few coins in your pocket. By 1948, he had built a company called Industrial Luncheon Services. It was a fleet of trucks, essentially mobile canteens, that drove to the factory gates and construction sites of Massachusetts to sell sandwiches, coffee, and snacks to hungry workers on their short breaks. It was a grueling, low-margin business, built on volume and speed. The trucks smelled of exhaust, ham sandwiches, and cheap tobacco. But Rosenberg, ever the observer, noticed something in the data. He didn't have sophisticated spreadsheets or algorithms. He had the cash register. And the register told him a fascinating story. He realized that while he sold ham sandwiches and sodas and chips, a staggering 40% of his entire revenue, nearly half of every single dollar he made, came from just 2 items, coffee and donuts. This was his epiphany. He realized he was wasting his time making sandwiches. The workers didn't want a meal. They wanted a jolt. They wanted the caffeine to wake them up and the sugar to keep them going. They wanted fuel. He realized that if he could strip away everything else, the soup, the sandwiches, the soda, and focus entirely on these 2 high-margin, high-demand items, he wouldn't just have a lunch truck, he would have a gold mine. So in 1948, he took a gamble. He took $5,000, a significant sum at the time, and opened a physical storefront in Quincy. He called it Open Kettle. It was not an immediate revolution. The name Open Kettle was generic, almost industrial. It sounded like a soup kitchen or a laundry service. But the concept inside was radical in its simplicity. While other coffee shops sold stale, hours-old brew and day-old pastries, Rosenberg was obsessed with freshness. He charged 5 cents for a donut and 10 cents for a cup of coffee. It was cheap, but it wasn't cheap quality. He famously insisted on using real cream, not milk, in the coffee. He demanded that the donuts be made fresh, on-site, throughout the day, filling the air with the intoxicating, irresistible smell of frying dough and sugar. It was a sensory trap. He offered 52 varieties of donuts, a staggering number compared to the standard 3 or 4 offered by competitors. He wanted a different flavor for every week of the year. The shop was a success, but Rosenberg, the hustler, was not satisfied. He felt the name was holding him back. He watched his customers. He saw how they ate. He saw the specific ritualistic way the shipyard workers would take their plain cake donut and dip it into the hot, dark coffee to soften it. He saw the joy in that small action. In 1950, he gathered his executives, mostly family and friends, and told them they were changing the name. They would rename the company after the action itself. They would call it Dunkin Donuts. This was the moment the brand truly was born. It wasn't just a name, it was an instruction manual. It told the customer exactly what to do. It was unpretentious. It was fun. It was perfectly blue collar. The rebrand worked. Sales exploded. The one store became 2, then 3. Rosenberg had tapped into a fundamental American need, the need for a cheap, warm, comforting ritual before the start of a hard day's work. He wasn't selling gastronomy. He was selling a 5-minute vacation from the factory floor. But Rosenberg had a bigger vision. He looked at the emerging fast food giants of the 1950s. McDonald's was just starting to stir, and Kentucky Fried Chicken was expanding. And he saw the future. He realized that opening stores himself with his own capital was too slow. He wanted to be everywhere. In 1955, he made the decision that would define the company's structure and its eventual fate. He decided to franchise. He signed his first agreement in Worcester, Massachusetts. This was a pivotal shift. He was no longer just selling donuts. He was selling the dream of selling donuts. He was selling a business in a box to other aspiring hustlers, immigrants, and families who wanted a piece of the American dream. The franchise model was the rocket fuel the company needed. It allowed Dunkin Donuts to expand at a terrifying speed without Rosenberg having to put up his own capital for every building. By 1963, just 8 years later, there were 100 shops. By 1979, there were 1,000. The Dunkin sign, with its bright, clashing orange and pink colors chosen specifically by Rosenberg's daughter because they looked happy, became a ubiquitous fixture of the American Northeast. It became the unofficial town square for the working class. It was where the police officers, the construction workers, and the truck drivers went. It was the anti-country club. It was democratic. Whether you were a CEO or a janitor, you paid the same nickel for the same glazed donut. But this explosive growth came with a hidden cost. The franchise model meant that Rosenberg was losing control. He wasn't running the stores. Independent operators were. And to keep them profitable, the system had to be rigid. The menu had to be standardized. The soul of the open kettle, the obsessively fresh handmade quality, began to be strained by the demands of industrial scale. Yet throughout the 1960s, the donut reigned supreme. It was the golden age of sugar. Nobody counted calories. Nobody worried about carbs. The donut was the perfect American food, fast, cheap, and sweet. Then came the 1970s. This decade brought the first great existential crisis to the brand, a crisis that would force it to harden its identity. The oil embargo and the resulting stagflation hit the American economy like a hammer. For a company like Dunkin, this was a catastrophe on 2 fronts. First, the cost of their raw materials, sugar, flour, and especially the oil used for frying, skyrocketed. Ingredients costs jumped by nearly 50%. Second, their core customer, the blue-collar worker, was being squeezed. Factories were closing. Inflation was eating paychecks. People had less money for luxuries, even a luxury as cheap as a donut. The company was dangerously close to bankruptcy. It was in this crucible of the 1970s that the brand's identity was truly cemented. To survive the economic downturn, Dunkin didn't go up market. They dug in. They didn't try to be fancy. They tried to be essential. In a world that felt chaotic and unstable, the company realized that Americans didn't just need cheap food. They needed to see someone working as hard as they were. They leaned harder into their identity as the fuel for the common man. This era gave birth to the single most important piece of marketing in the brand's history, a character who would become more famous than William Rosenberg himself, Fred the Baker. The commercials were simple, repetitive, and brilliant. They showed a tired, mustachioed man waking up in the pitch black of 4 a.m., rain battering his window. He would drag himself out of bed, put on his white uniform, and mutter the mantra that would become a national catchphrase, "Time to make the donuts." It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. It was a commercial about work, and America loved it. They saw themselves in Fred. He wasn't a chef. He was a worker. He was reliable. He was there every morning, rain or shine, making the product fresh. This campaign saved the company. It solidified the brand's brand halo, not as a treat, but as a necessity. It aligned the brand with the virtue of hard work. It told the customer, "We work hard, just like you." Fred the Baker was played by an actor named Michael Vale, and he played the role for 15 years. He became the face of the company. But Fred represented something else, something that would eventually become a trap. Fred represented the past. He represented a specific type of manual labor, a specific type of bakery, and a specific type of food that was slowly falling out of favor. While Fred was charming the nation in the 1980s, a structural rot was setting in. The donut itself was becoming a problem. The health-conscious 1980s had arrived. The fried dough that had been a staple of the 1950s was starting to look like a health hazard. The Jane Fonda workout era had begun. People were looking for light breakfasts. Bagels, muffins, and yogurt were rising. Dunkin scrambled to adapt. They introduced muffins. They introduced bagels. They tried to diversify the menu to survive the changing American diet. They tried to be everything to everyone. But the name on the door was still Donuts. They were trapped by their own identity. And then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a new, far more dangerous threat emerged from the rainy Northwest. It was a threat that William Rosenberg, in his wildest dreams, could never have predicted. A small company from Seattle led by a visionary named Howard Schultz was about to change the entire world's relationship with coffee. Starbucks was coming. Starbucks didn't just sell coffee, they sold status. They sold Italian roast. They sold a third place with jazz music and comfortable chairs. They sold a $4 latte that made you feel sophisticated. They sold an experience that was the exact opposite of the fluorescent-lit, plastic seat reality of Dunkin Donuts. For Dunkin Donuts, this was a nightmare. Suddenly, their 50-cent cup of coffee, served in a styrofoam cup under harsh lights, wasn't just cheap, it was trash. It was low class. The blue-collar identity that had been their armor for 40 years was suddenly their weakness. They were losing the morning. The white-collar workers, the suburban moms, the young professionals, the people with disposable income were flocking to Starbucks. Dunkin was being left behind with the old men and the cigarette smokers. By the mid-1990s, William Rosenberg's empire was at a crossroads. He had retired, handing the reins to his son, and eventually to corporate leadership, but his vision was under siege. The franchise model had scaled them to thousands of stores, but the brand was stale. They were bleeding market share to the third wave of coffee. They were seen as a relic of the past. The donut was dying and the coffee was being reinvented by someone else. The company faced a brutal reality. They had spent 50 years building a kingdom on sugar and grease, and now the world wanted foam and espresso. The idealistic rise was over. The lunch wagon dream had hit its ceiling. The company was facing a slow, agonizing slide into irrelevance. They needed to change. But to change, they would have to declare war on their own history. They would have to kill Fred the Baker and everything he stood for. They would have to betray the very thing that made them famous. The era of the donut was ending, and the era of the coffee war was about to begin. The battle for the American soul. By the mid-1990s, the open kettle dream was rusting. The empire William Rosenberg had built on the simple, honest foundation of a nickel donut was facing a threat it did not understand. For 50 years, Dunkin Donuts had been the undisputed king of the American morning. It was the default. It was where you went because there was nowhere else to go. But in the rain-soaked Pacific Northwest, a new empire had risen. One that didn't just want to sell coffee. It wanted to change the way human beings lived. Starbucks was not just a competitor. It was a cultural indictment. Howard Schultz had returned from Italy with a vision that was diametrically opposed to everything Dunkin stood for. He wasn't selling fuel. He was selling the third place. He was selling a sophisticated European-style lounge with jazz music, velvet armchairs, and baristas in green aprons, who spoke a new foreign language of grande, venti, and macchiato. To the Dunkin leadership in Randolph, Massachusetts, this initially looked like a fad. Who would pay $4 for a cup of coffee? Who would wait 5 minutes for a drink? It seemed absurd, but they had underestimated the deep aspirational hunger of the American middle class. In the booming economy of the 1990s, people didn't just want to be rich, they wanted to feel rich. And a white paper cup with a green mermaid logo was the cheapest status symbol money could buy. Suddenly the Dunkin experience, the harsh fluorescent lighting, the linoleum floors, the smell of old fryer grease, the styrofoam cups, wasn't just simple, it was trashy, it was low class. The blue-collar identity that had been their armor for decades was now their greatest weakness. They were losing the most valuable demographic in the history of commerce, the white-collar commuter. The lawyers, the executives, the soccer moms, they were all migrating to the third place, leaving Dunkin behind, with the smokers and the retirees. The data was terrifying. As the new millennium dawned, Starbucks was opening stores at a viral pace, growing from a regional curiosity to a global omnipresence. Every new Starbucks that opened across the street from a Dunkin was a tombstone. Dunkin was bleeding market share. They were losing the coffee war because they were bringing a donut to a gunfight. The company, which was then owned by a British conglomerate called Allied Domecq, a distant, liquor-focused parent company that barely understood the nuances of the American breakfast market, was in a state of paralysis. They tried to copy Starbucks. They introduced bagels to compete with the healthier trend. They tinkered with the coffee blend. But they were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The brand was seen as a dinosaur. In the early 2000s, facing a slow slide into irrelevance, the leadership at Dunkin made the single most critical strategic decision in the brand's modern history. They stopped looking at Starbucks and they started looking at their own customers. They commissioned deep psychological market research. They wanted to know who is still coming to us and why. The answer was a revelation. They discovered that the people who came to Dunkin didn't just prefer Dunkin, they actively hated Starbucks. They hated the pretension. They hated the confusing menu. They hated the barista theater. They hated the jazz music. They didn't want a third place to sit and write a screenplay or have a business meeting. They wanted to get their coffee, get back in their truck or their car and get to work. They wanted speed. They wanted simplicity. They wanted respect for their time, not an experience. This insight changed everything. It reframed the war. Dunkin realized they couldn't win by being a worse Starbucks. They could only win by being the anti-Starbucks. In 2006, they launched the campaign that would define their survival. It was the most aggressive, populist, and brilliant piece of marketing since the Pepsi Challenge. The slogan was simple, rhythmic, and undeniably true: America runs on Dunkin. It was a masterstroke of class warfare. It drew a line in the sand. Starbucks was for the elite, for the people who had time to lounge. Dunkin was for the engine of the country. It was for the nurses on the night shift, the firefighters, the police officers, the construction workers, the teachers. It turned their cheap coffee into fuel for the hard-working. It made the styrofoam cup a badge of honor. It told the customer, "You are too busy running the world to learn Italian words for coffee." But a slogan wasn't enough. To win the war, they had to fix the weapon. They couldn't keep selling the harsh, acidic brew of the 1980s. Quietly, aggressively, the company overhauled its entire coffee supply chain. They hired coffee expert, poached from the premium world, to create a new blend. It had to be smoother, richer, and higher quality, but it had to remain accessible. They launched their own line of espresso drinks, lattes, and cappuccinos, but they marketed them with a brilliant twist. They were lattes without the lecture. They were cheaper, faster, and sweeter. They democratized the espresso. This pivot saved the company, but it created a new, profound internal conflict. It was the beginning of an existential schism between the two halves of the name, Dunkin versus Donuts. For 50 years, the donut had been the hero. It was the logo. It was Fred the baker. But in the cold light of the 2000s financial analysis, the donut was a villain. The financial reality was brutal. A donut is a terrible product. It requires expensive ingredients: flour, yeast, sugar, shortening. It requires expensive equipment: fryers, glazing tables, and most importantly, it requires expensive labor. To make a good donut, you need a baker. You need someone there at 3 a.m. And the product has a shelf life of about 4 hours before it goes stale. You have to throw away huge amounts of waste every single night. Coffee, on the other hand, is a miracle. It is flavored water. The margins are astronomical, often 90% or higher. A cup of iced coffee costs pennies to make and sells for $3. It requires zero skill to pour. It has zero waste. The leadership looked at the spreadsheets and realized the hard truth. Coffee was the profit engine. Donuts were just the anchor dragging the ship down. In 2006, shortly after the launch of the America Runs on Dunkin campaign, the company was sold. Allied Domec was broken up, and Dunkin Brands was acquired by a consortium of private equity firms, Bain Capital, the Carlyle Group, and Thomas H. Lee Partners. The price was $2.4 billion. Private equity firms are not sentimental. They do not care about heritage. They do not care about William Rosenberg's legacy. They care about efficiency, cash flow, and exit strategy. When the private equity owners looked at Dunkin, they didn't see a bakery. They saw a beverage company that was being held hostage by a bakery. They saw that beverages, coffee, iced tea, and the sugary high-margin culotta were generating 60% of the profit, despite being treated as a side dish. They gave the order, pivot to beverages. This was the beginning of the physical transformation of the brand. If you walked into a Dunkin Donuts in 2008 versus 1998, the difference was stark. The bakery case, that glowing glass cathedral of donuts that had once been the centerpiece of the store, was shrunk. It was moved to the side. It was pushed into the shadows. In its place, front and center, were the machines, high-speed espresso makers, massive banks of coffee brewers, rows of flavor pumps, hazelnut, French vanilla, caramel. The orange and pink logo remained, but the smell of frying dough, the sensory signature of the brand for half a century, was gone. It was replaced by the smell of roasting beans and burnt milk. To achieve this efficiency, the company made a controversial operational decision. They began to dismantle the in-store kitchens. The Fred the Baker model, making the donuts fresh, on-site every morning, was too expensive. It didn't fit the beverage model. They moved to a central kitchen model. Donuts were now mass-produced in massive industrial factories in the middle of the night, loaded onto trucks and driven to the stores before dawn. This was the death of the open kettle promise. The donuts were no longer fresh. They were freshly delivered. They were often cold. The variety shrank. The jelly donut was often sold out by 10 a.m. because the truck wasn't coming back until tomorrow. The old guard customers felt betrayed. They complained that the donuts tasted rubbery, that the soul was gone. Franchisees, many of whom were second-generation donut men, were furious. They felt they were being turned into gas stations that sold stale cake. But the private equity owners didn't care about the complaints of the few, because the numbers from the many were spectacular. The pivot worked. America runs on Dunkin' resonated. The beverage sales skyrocketed. The high-margin iced coffees and lattes were printing money. The company weathered the 2008 financial crisis better than almost any other restaurant chain because it was selling affordable luxury. When people couldn't afford a vacation or a new car or even a Starbucks latte, they could still afford a $2 Dunkin' iced coffee. It was a small treat in a hard world. By 2010, the company had been stabilized. It was profitable. It was growing. It was winning the value side of the coffee war. But a new problem was emerging, the name, Dunkin Donuts. It was a name that promised something the company no longer really wanted to sell. Every time a customer read the sign, they thought of a donut. They thought of sugar. They thought of unhealthy. And most dangerously, they thought of morning. The beverage strategy required people to buy coffee all day long, but donuts is a breakfast word. The name was a cage. It was limiting the brand to the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. To truly compete with Starbucks, to truly become a global fuel station, they needed to break out of the breakfast prison. They needed to sell sandwiches, snacks, and drinks at 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. The internal discussions began to turn toward the unthinkable. The donut had to die, not just the product, but the word itself. It was a terrified whisper in the boardroom at first. Removing the word donuts from the logo was considered corporate suicide. It would be like McDonald's removing hamburgers. It was erasing the founder. It was erasing the history. But the private equity owners, preparing to take the company public again, which they did in 2011, knew that the future valuation of the company depended on it being seen as a beverage-led growth story, not a legacy bakery. They began a slow psychological conditioning campaign. They started shrinking the word donuts on the napkins. They started referring to themselves internally as just Dunkin'. They launched the slogan, Just Dunkin'. They were preparing the public and themselves for the execution. The coffee wars had saved the business, but they had destroyed its identity. The company that William Rosenberg built to feed hungry workers with fresh handmade food was now a high-speed caffeine dispensary, relying on factory-made pastries. They had won the war for the wallet of the working class, but the cost was the very thing that made them special. And just as they were grappling with this identity crisis, a new threat appeared on the horizon, a threat that made Starbucks look like a minor nuisance. The year was 2010. The iPhone was 3 years old. The world was going digital. And the next war wasn't going to be about who had the best coffee. It was going to be about who had the best app. Dunkin, a company built on cash transactions and face-to-face service, was completely unprepared for the digital revolution. They were about to be forced to diversify again, this time not into a new product, but into a new dimension. They were about to stop being a restaurant and start being a tech company. The war for data. The year was 2010. The coffee wars had been fought to a stalemate. Dunkin had successfully defended its blue-collar fortress with the America Runs on Dunkin campaign, securing the loyalty of the working class against the snobbery of Starbucks. But just as the smoke was clearing from that battlefield, the ground beneath them shifted again. And this time, it wasn't about the beans. It was about the device in every customer's pocket. The iPhone was 3 years old. The world was going digital. And the leadership at Dunkin' Brands, sitting in their headquarters in Canton, Massachusetts, looked at their greatest rival and saw something that terrified them. Starbucks wasn't just selling lattes anymore. They were building a bank. The Starbucks mobile app, launched in 2009, was a juggernaut. It allowed customers to load money, pay with a scan, and earn stars. It was frictionless. But beneath the convenience lay a weapon that Dunkin' did not possess: data. Starbucks knew exactly who their customers were. They knew what they drank, what time they woke up, how often they visited, and exactly what price point would trigger them to buy a pastry. They had a direct digital line of communication into the pockets of millions of Americans. Dunkin', by contrast, was flying blind. For 60 years, their business model had been built on cash transactions. A guy in a truck pulled up, handed a $5 bill to a cashier, got his coffee, and left. He was anonymous. Dunkin' didn't know his name. They didn't know if he came every day or once a month. They didn't know if he stopped coming because he died, moved away, or simply decided he liked McDonald's better. In the analog age, this anonymity was fine. In the digital age, this blindness was a death sentence. The private equity owners and the executive leadership realized with chilling clarity that they were no longer in a war for share of throat. They were in a war for share of screen. If they could not get on the customer's phone, they would cease to exist. This realization birthed the most radical, expensive, and risky land-sun diversification strategy in the company's history. They decided to stop being a hospitality company, a place where you went to be served by a human being, and start being a transactional tech platform. The pivot began in earnest in 2012, but the challenge was immense. Unlike Starbucks, whose customers were early adopters of technology, affable to scanning QR codes and linking credit cards, Dunkin's core demographic was older, more traditional, and cash-reliant. How do you convince a 50-year-old construction worker to download an app to buy a donut? You have to bribe him. You have to gamify his breakfast. In 2014, the company launched DD Perks. On the surface, it looked like a digital version of the old punch card. Buy 10, get 1 free. But in reality, it was a sophisticated data mining engine. The company spent millions developing the back-end infrastructure, partnering with tech giants to build a system that could process millions of transactions per second. The goal was not just loyalty, it was behavioral modification. The reason for this massive investment was simple: frictionless commerce. The leadership had analyzed the pain points of their business. The biggest pain point was the line. The line was the enemy. Every second a customer spent waiting behind someone fumbling for change was a second of lost revenue. It was a second where they might decide it's too busy and drive away. The app was the solution. it shifted the labor of ordering from the cashier, who cost money, to the customer, who worked for free. The rollout was aggressive. They offered free beverages just for signing up. They pushed Mobile Mondays. And slowly, the data began to flow. The effectiveness was immediate and staggering. The app allowed Dunkin to do something it could never do before: hyper-targeted psychological manipulation. If the algorithm noticed that a regular customer hadn't visited in 4 days, it would automatically push a notification to their phone. "We miss you. Here is a $2 latte offer." It was a digital hook, dragging the customer back into the store. If a customer usually bought a medium coffee, the app would suggest a hash brown for just $1 more. It was the art of the upsell, automated and personalized for millions of people simultaneously. By 2016, the digital pivot entered its next, more physical phase: on-the-go mobile ordering. This allowed customers to order ahead and skip the line entirely. This sounds convenient, but to execute it, Dunkin had to physically destroy the open Kettle layout that William Rosenberg had designed. If you walked into a renovated Dunkin store in 2017, you saw the scars of this transformation. The comfortable chairs where old men used to sit and talk for hours were removed. The tables were shrunk or eliminated entirely. The bakery case, once the glowing glass cathedral of donuts that was the heart of the shop, was pushed to the side, hidden behind counters, or shrunk down to a small display. In its place, front and center, was the mobile pickup station. It was a shelf, a simple wooden shelf, but it was the new altar of the brand. The message to the customer was subtle but brutal. Do not stay, do not linger, do not talk to the staff. Order on your phone, grab your cup from the shelf, and get out. The store was no longer a shop, it was a fulfillment center. The staff were no longer servers or bakers. They were assembly line workers, racing against a digital timer on a screen that told them how many seconds they had to fill a mobile order before the customer arrived. The human element, the chat about the weather, the smile, the connection, was engineered out of the system in the name of speed. This digital lawn sun fundamentally changed the financial structure of the company. Digital orders were, as the data showed, consistently higher margin than in-person orders. When a customer ordered on a screen, they didn't feel the social pressure or the judgment of a human being. They felt free to customize. They would add an extra shot of espresso, an extra swirl of caramel, an extra side of bacon. The average ticket size for a mobile order was significantly higher. The phone screen gave customers permission to indulge in their worst, most sugary impulses, and Dunkin profited from every pump of syrup. By 2018, the pivot was complete. The app had over 12 million active users. Digital sales were growing at double-digit rates, far outpacing traditional traffic. The on-the-go customer was visiting more often and spending more money. The company had successfully transitioned from a legacy bakery to a digital fuel station. But there was a ghost in the machine. The Dunkin that existed on the app was efficient, modern, and profitable. But the Dunkin that existed in the real world was becoming cold. It was becoming a utility. The app had solved the wallet problem. It had secured the loyalty of the working adult who needed speed. But it had created a heart problem. To the next generation, Gen Z, Dunkin wasn't cool. It was a utilitarian app that their parents used to get coffee before work. It lacked hype. It lacked culture. The technology had made them efficient, but it hadn't made them desirable. And in the attention economy of the late 2000s, efficiency wasn't enough. You needed to be a lifestyle. You needed to be a brand that people wanted to wear, not just drink. The leadership realized that the digital pivot was only the foundation. To survive the next decade, they would need to execute an even stranger, more desperate Lan-Sun. They would need to leave the food industry entirely and enter the bizarre, high-stakes world of streetwear fashion and influencer culture. They had the data. Now they needed the clout. The merchants of hype. By 2017, Dunkin had successfully engineered itself into a high-speed, data-driven utility. The app was working. The on-the-go lanes were moving. The company was profitable, efficient, and aggressively modern. But in the boardrooms of Canton, Massachusetts, a new and quieter anxiety was beginning to fester. They had solved the problem of the morning commute, but they were facing a looming demographic cliff that threatened to swallow their future. The problem was no longer Starbucks. The problem was age. To the core demographic, the nurses, the construction workers, the commuters, Dunkin was an essential part of the day. But to their children, the rising generation known as Gen Z, Dunkin was invisible. Or worse, it was uncool. It was Dad's coffee. It was the place where you bought a Boston cream in a styrofoam cup. In the hyper-visual, Instagram-filtered, TikTok-driven world of the late 2000s, Dunkin was visually offensive. It was plastic, orange, and aggressively synthetic in an era that faded organic, aesthetic, and artisanal. The marketing leadership realized that efficiency was not enough. You cannot build a 50-year future on a customer base that is slowly aging out of the workforce. They needed to capture the youth. But they faced a paradox. They couldn't rebrand as a hipster cafe. That would alienate their loyal blue-collar base and destroy the America runs on Dunkin' identity. They couldn't be authentic in the way a local coffee roaster was. So they decided to do something far more audacious, something that required a profound understanding of the bizarre, irony-poisoned psychology of the modern internet. They decided to lean into their own uncoolness until it came full circle and became camp. They decided to stop being a food company and start being a streetwear brand. This was the birth of the lifestyle pivot. It was a strategic decision to treat the Dunkin' logo not as a mark of quality, but as a badge of ironic, self-aware identity. The logic was rooted in the rise of hype beast culture, a world where brands like Supreme could slap a logo on a clay brick and sell it for $50, simply because it was absurd. Dunkin' realized that in the digital age, consumers didn't just want to consume a product, they wanted to wear it. They wanted to signal their tribe. And the Dunkin' tribe, the unapologetic, caffeinated, slightly messy, anti-snob realists, was a powerful identity to wear. The first major strike in this war for cultural relevance came in 2018, and it came from a place nobody expected, the feet. Dunkin' announced a collaboration not with a food company, but with Saucony, a serious heritage running shoe brand also based in Massachusetts. On paper, it made no sense. What does a glazed donut have to do with marathon running? But the marketing team connected the dots with a brilliant literal interpretation of their own slogan. If America runs on Dunkin', then America needs running shoes. They released the Saucony X Dunkin' Kinvara. It was not a subtle shoe. It was a loud, screaming collision of bright orange, hot pink, and white. It featured a donut on the laces. It had coffee beans printed on the insole. It came in a box that looked exactly like a dozen donut carton. It was ridiculous. It was ugly. And it was absolute genius. The shoes were released just days before the Boston Marathon. They sold out in minutes. They didn't just sell to runners, they sold to sneakerheads, to fashion bloggers, to kids in Los Angeles and Tokyo who had never run a mile in their lives. Pairs immediately appeared on resale sites like StockX for hundreds of dollars over retail. For the executives at Dunkin', this was the proof of concept. They realized that their orange and pink color scheme which for years had been seen as garish and outdated, was actually a proprietary asset. It was visually arresting. It popped on a smartphone screen. They had stumbled upon the secret of the Instagram age. Ugly is better than boring. Loud is better than tasteful. Emboldened by the shoe success, they expanded the Lanson strategy into a full-blown merchandising empire. They didn't just sell t-shirts, they sold a lifestyle. They launched holiday pop-up shops online that sold Dunkin onesies, Dunkin electric guitars, and even Dunkin scented candles. They turned their customers into walking billboards. But unlike the Fred the Baker era, where the uniform represented work, these new clothes represented leisure. They represented a carefree, sugar-fueled, slightly chaotic existence that resonated perfectly with the mood of the internet. The revenue from this merchandise was a drop in the bucket compared to coffee sales, but the value was astronomical. Every time a teenager posted a selfie in a Dunkin hoodie, they were doing marketing work that no billboard could ever achieve. They were laundering the brand's image, scrubbing away the old man stigma, and replacing it with a veneer of ironic cool. But merchandise was just the warm-up, the true lifestyle pivot, the move that would fundamentally alter the company's trajectory and cement its value for the coming acquisition, happened in 2020. It was the moment Dunkin stopped looking at traditional celebrities and looked at the phone screen. For decades, brands like Pepsi had hired stars: Michael Jackson, Beyoncé, Britney Spears, distant, untouchable gods of culture. But Dunkin realized that Gen Z didn't care about gods. They cared about influencers. They cared about people who looked like them, filmed in bedrooms, dancing to 15-second clips of audio. The king of pop was dead. The queen of TikTok was rising. Her name was Charli D'Amelio. She was a 16-year-old dancer from Connecticut with 100 million followers and a genuine, unforced addiction to Dunkin' coffee. She wasn't paid to hold the cup. She held it in every video because she actually drank it. She was the perfect avatar for the brand: suburban, relatable, slightly hyperactive, and fueled by sugar. In September 2020, Dunkin made the deal official, but they didn't just film a commercial. That would have been the old way. They integrated her into the menu. They launched the Charli. It wasn't even a new drink. It was just her standard order: a cold brew with whole milk and 3 pumps of caramel swirl. It was simple, it was replicable, and it was an atomic bomb of marketing. The day the Charli launched, the Dunkin app broke. It shattered download records. The sales of cold brew across the entire nationwide system skyrocketed by 20% in a single day, and then 45% the next. Stores ran out of caramel. Franchisees were in a panic, not because they were failing, but because they couldn't physically pump syrup fast enough to feed the hordes of teenagers who were driving to Dunkin' not for coffee, but to film a TikTok of themselves drinking the Charli. This was the diversification strategy perfected. Dunkin hadn't just sold a beverage. They had sold membership in a cultural moment. They had bridged the gap between the construction worker, who was there for the fuel, and the teenage girl who was there for the clout. They had proven that a 70-year-old bakery could speak the language of a 16-year-old dancer. The lifestyle pivot did something else, something crucial for the financial sharks circling the water. It proved that the brand had elasticity. It proved that Dunkin could exist outside the 4 walls of the store. It could be a shoe. It could be a meme. It could be a viral video. This elasticity meant that the brand was future-proof. It wasn't tethered to the declining mechanics of the traditional fast food restaurant. It was a piece of intellectual property that could be monetized in infinite ways. By late 2020, Dunkin was no longer the dusty, struggling chain of the late 90s. It had cleaned up its operations with the digital pivot. It had revitalized its soul with the lifestyle pivot. It had killed the word donuts to free itself from the bakery case. It was lean, it was fast, it was data-rich, and it was culturally relevant. It had become the perfect corporate asset. It was a shiny, high-speed machine humming with profit and potential. And in the world of high finance, when you build a perfect machine, you do not get to keep it. You get eaten. The open kettle was about to be closed forever. The family business was gone. The public company was about to vanish. The sharks had finished circling, and they were ready to strike. The era of independence was ending, and the era of the portfolio was about to begin. The death of independence. By the autumn of 2020, the Dunkin machine was running at maximum velocity. The painful surgery of the previous decade, the digital pivot, the death of the donut name, the Charlie hype, had all been leading to this single, inevitable moment. The company had successfully transformed itself from a legacy bakery into a high-speed, data-rich, culturally relevant beverage platform. It was lean. It was profitable. It was future-proof. In the cold calculus of Wall Street, it had become the perfect asset. And in the world of modern capitalism, when you become the perfect asset, you do not remain independent. You get harvested. The predator that emerged from the shadows was not a rival coffee chain. It was a new kind of monster, a multi-brand conglomerate called Inspire Brands. Backed by the immense capital of Rourke Capital Group, a private equity firm, Inspire was building a restaurant empire not by creating brands, but by collecting them. They already owned Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, and Sonic. They were assembling a portfolio of category killers, and they needed a breakfast champion to complete their set. In October 2020, the deal was announced. Inspire Brands would acquire Dunkin Brands for $11.3 billion. The number was staggering. It represented a premium of nearly 20% over the stock price. It was one of the largest restaurant deals in history. For the shareholders, it was a triumph. The private equity firms that had bought and sold the company over the years had squeezed every drop of value from the stone. But for the soul of the company, for the memory of William Rosenberg and the independent spirit of the open kettle, it was a quiet execution. When the deal closed in late 2020, Dunkin ceased to be a public company. It was delisted from the stock exchange. The quarterly earnings calls, the public scrutiny, the transparency, it all vanished behind the velvet curtain of private equity. The company was no longer a fighter from Massachusetts. It was a line item in a portfolio based in Atlanta. But the machine did not stop. Under Inspire's ownership, the strategies that had been piloted in the late 2000s were accelerated with ruthless efficiency. The land-sun diversification was no longer an experiment. It was the standard operating procedure. By 2025, the results of this acquisition are clear, and they paint a picture of a company that has fundamentally changed its nature. The Dunkin of 2025 is a financial juggernaut. As the outline notes, Inspire Brands reported revenue of $11.2 billion in 2022, with Dunkin acting as a primary engine of that growth. The brand has expanded to over 12,000 stores in 40 countries, but the way it makes money has shifted. The beverage-led strategy is now absolute. The tap system for nitro cold brew and iced tea is the centerpiece of every new store. The next-gen store design, which emphasizes mobile pickup and drive-through efficiency over seating, is now the global standard. In the UK, a market that had historically rejected the brand, the new digital-first model is growing at 10% a year. In India, the menu has been aggressively glocalized, abandoning the American donut-centric approach for savory, local options that pair with the high-margin coffee. The lifestyle pivot has also matured. The merchandise, The shoes, the hoodies, the scented candles is no longer a novelty. It is a consistent, high-margin revenue stream, estimated at $50 million a year. It serves a dual purpose. It generates profit, and it keeps the brand sticky in the minds of Gen Z consumers who might otherwise drift to newer, trendier chains. Financially, the company is stronger than it has ever been. The profit margins, once dragged down by the labor-intensive donut making, have climbed to an estimated 15%, fueled by the efficiency of the app and the high markup on complex beverages. The risk of the business has been diversified away. By sitting inside the Inspire brand's portfolio, Dunkin is insulated. If coffee prices spike, the burger sales at Sonic or the wing sales at Buffalo Wild Wings can absorb the blow. It is a fortress of capital. However, this financial victory has come with a cultural silence. The internal drama of the past, the fights with franchisees, the backlash over the name change has been quieted by the sheer weight of profit. The franchisees, once the vocal guardians of the brand's soul, have largely fallen in line, placated by the undeniable fact that the new system makes money. The Civil War is over, the donut lost, the data won. The acquisition was the final act of the transformation. It locked the changes in place. There is no going back to the open kettle. There is no going back to Fred, the baker. The Dunkin of 2025 is a sleek, optimized global node in a massive corporate network. It is a triumph of modern business engineering. It is everything William Rosenberg wanted his company to be: successful, global, dominant. And yet, standing in a silent, chairless next-gen store in 2025, waiting for a mobile order to appear on a shelf, one cannot help but feel that while the company gained the world, it lost the specific, chaotic human magic that made it worth visiting in the first place. The price of survival. The acquisition by Inspire Brands in late 2020 was not a funeral, it was a harvest. When the ink dried on the $11.3 billion deal, Dunkin Brands ceased to be a public company accountable to shareholders and became a private asset in a massive, diversified portfolio. It was the final validation of the ruthless strategies implemented over the previous decade. The death of the word donuts, the digitization of the customer, the pivot to hype marketing, all of it had worked. It had turned a dusty regional bakery chain into one of the most valuable quick-service restaurant brands on earth. But as we stand in 2025, looking back at the trajectory from William Rosenberg's open kettle to this global titan, we are left with a singular, haunting lesson about the nature of modern capitalism. The price of survival is identity. The most profound lesson of the Dunkin saga is that nostalgia is a trap. For 40 years, the company was paralyzed by its own history. It was trapped by the ghost of Fred the baker, by the smell of frying dough, by the expectation of a 5-cent treat. The brand's leadership, particularly in the critical window between 2006 and 2019, realized that to save the business, they had to commit corporate patricide. They had to kill the founder's vision to save the founder's company. The removal of the word donuts from the sign was not just a rebranding. It was an act of liberation. It taught the business world that a legacy brand cannot survive by catering to the memories of its oldest customers. It must brutally adapt to the habits of its newest ones. By becoming a beverage-led company, Dunkin admitted that the donut was no longer the hero. It was just a sidecar to the caffeine addiction that truly drives the American economy. This willingness to amputate a beloved part of its own name is a lesson in unsentimental courage. It proves that in a rapidly changing market, holding on to heritage for the sake of tradition is a death sentence. The brands that survive are the ones willing to burn down their own museums. The second lesson is one of class warfare as a marketing strategy. In the face of the Starbucks juggernaut, Dunkin could have tried to gentrify. They could have installed jazz music and faux leather armchairs. They could have tried to be a discount Starbucks. Instead, they did something brilliant and counterintuitive. They weaponized their blue-collar roots. The America Runs on Dunkin campaign was not just a slogan, it was a line in the sand. It told the nurse, the construction worker, and the exhausted teacher that they didn't need a third place to lounge in. They needed fuel to keep the world turning. By positioning themselves as the anti-snob alternative, they secured a fanatical loyalty that transcended the quality of the coffee itself. They proved that in a polarized culture, pretension is a weakness that can be exploited. They didn't win the coffee wars by making better coffee. They won by making the customer feel better about drinking it. This teaches us that knowing who you aren't is just as important as knowing who you are. By embracing their identity as a utility rather than a luxury, they tapped into a deep vein of American populism that insulated them from economic downturns. When the economy crashes, people give up the $5 luxury latte, but they cling to the $2 necessary fuel. However, the final and perhaps most tragic lesson lies in the Lansan diversification into technology and lifestyle. This is where the human cost of the success becomes visible. William Rosenberg built his empire on human connection. He explicitly designed his shops so that the customer could see the baker, smell the dough, and talk to the staff. It was a community hub. It was a place of friction. The modern Dunkin, dominated by the app, the drive-thru, and the mobile order pickup shelf, has engineered humanity out of the transaction. The goal of the modern corporation is frictionless commerce, but friendship is a form of friction. A conversation is friction. By removing it, Dunkin gained speed, but it lost its soul. The community is no longer in the store. It is in the data cloud. The pivot to lifestyle marketing, the sneakers, the TikTok stars, the merchandise, reinforces this detachment. It proves that in the 2020s, a brand does not need to be a physical reality. It can be a digital meme. The success of the Charli D'Amelio partnership taught the industry that authenticity is no longer about the product. It is about the association. Teenagers didn't flock to Dunkin because they loved the taste of cold brew. They went because they wanted to participate in a viral moment. The brand became a prop in their own digital lives. This is a profitable strategy, but it is a volatile one. It ties the fortune of a 70-year-old company to the fleeting whims of internet culture. It transforms a service business into a hype business. Today, as Dunkin expands aggressively into China, India, and beyond under the Inspire brand's umbrella, it is a flawless, high-speed, data-driven machine. It is everything a modern corporation strives to be. It is resilient, diversified, and incredibly wealthy. But if you look closely at the orange and pink logo, you can see the scars of the surgery. The donut is gone. The open kettle is long forgotten. The smell of fresh baking has been replaced by the hum of espresso machines and the beep of barcode scanners. The Fred the Baker archetype, the man who woke up at 4 a.m. to make something with his hands, has been replaced by the fulfillment specialist who grabs a cup from a machine. William Rosenberg, the man who dropped out of 8th grade to feed hungry workers during the Depression, succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He built a company that literally runs America. But the ultimate irony and the final lesson of this story is that to keep running, the company had to stop being a place where you lingered and become a place you leave. It had to stop feeding the soul and start fueling the body. The ultimate lesson of Dunkin is that you can have the heart of a bakery or the profit of a tech platform, but you cannot, in the end, have both. The smiling Dunkin logo remains, but the donut that birthed it is now just a ghost, a silent partner in a multi-billion-dollar empire that outgrew the very thing that made it sweet.